It was October 17th, 2006, just another cold Tuesday in the steel town of Mayfield, Pennsylvania. The kind of town where things didn't change much. Factory whistle in the morning, tired faces at the diner, traffic thinning by 8 p.m., and then silence. Except for the furnace roar coming from Claremont Steelworks just outside town limits. That night, 42-year-old Russell Kinley stepped out of his modest beige two-bedroom home around 10:25 p.m. His wife Elaine had just finished washing dishes, and their daughter Bryn, barely 16, was curled up on the couch watching late-night reruns. He kissed them both goodnight, like he always did, grabbed his thermos, and backed his '98 Ford Ranger out of the driveway. It wasn't snowing yet, but the chill hinted it would soon. No one thought it would be the last time they'd see him. Russell wasn't the kind of man to make waves. He worked third shift at Claremont as a maintenance tech, handling everything from blown light fixtures to jammed conveyor belts. He was quiet, dependable, and didn't miss work unless he was truly ill. He kept his boots in his locker, always showed up early, and drank the same black coffee from the same scratch thermos for nearly a decade. There was no reason to think something was off that night. No argument at home, no unusual behavior, no cryptic goodbye. He clocked out the night before like normal and said he'd be back tomorrow. But by 7 a.m., Elaine was pacing. Russell still hadn't come home. No call, no message. She tried his phone. Straight to voicemail. She thought maybe overtime. He'd pulled doubles before when the machinery went haywire. She called the plant. A woman at the front desk paused, said she'd check. Came back confused. Russell hadn't clocked in. Not last night. Not at all. Elaine froze. She repeated the statement like it didn't make sense, but she'd watched him leave. The woman double-checked. No record of his badge scan past October 16th. Elaine asked if he might have gone in without clocking. They said no one saw him. But then, he wasn't the type to skip a punch. She asked about his truck. The woman didn't know. A half-hour later, a shift manager walked the lot and found it. A green Ranger with a cracked taillight, parked near the east entrance where Russell always left it, locked, untouched. By noon, Elaine filed a missing persons report with the county sheriff's office. At first, they handled it like a late show. Maybe Russell wandered off, maybe stress, maybe even something medical. But nothing added up. He had no history of mental illness, no debts, no arguments at home. His bank account hadn't moved. His keys and phone weren't found in the truck, but his jacket was. The weather that night had dropped below 40. Why would he walk anywhere without it? Deputies secured permission from the plant to search the premises. Union rules required a rep to be present. Inside Russell's locker, they found his street. Clothes, wallet, and a pair of worn gloves. His steel-toe boots were gone, meaning he'd changed into uniform before going missing. But the logs showed no maintenance requests assigned to him that night. No calls, no radio logs. His name wasn't mentioned in the floor shift notes. It was like he'd arrived, and then simply disappeared. Security footage became the next focus. The factory had aging cameras. Some were more for insurance than actual surveillance. But a 10:42 p.m. timestamp showed Russell swiping in at the employee entrance. He walked past the break room, carrying his thermos. After that, nothing. No exit. No second angle. The interior cameras weren't all functional. Some were dummies. Others hadn't recorded properly in months, and no camera showed him leaving. Search teams swept the immediate area. Parking lot, boiler rooms, old storage sheds, nearby access roads. A dog team was brought in the next day. They tracked a weak scent trail to the northern service corridor, but it stopped cold near the ventilation gate. No blood, no scuffle, no personal items. Just silence. Elaine's voice cracked as she gave her first on-camera statement to the local news. She stood in her kitchen, holding a framed photo from their last family camping trip. He wouldn't leave us, she said, almost like she was still trying to convince herself. Bryn stood off camera, arms folded, lips pressed tight. Her father's keys still hung on the wall by the back door. His dinner plate still sat in the drying rack. Elaine didn't move any of it. Within days, rumors flooded the town. Theories spread. Maybe he ran. Maybe there was someone else. Maybe he'd fallen into machinery. But there were no signs of any of it. Even seasoned detectives admitted it was rare to see a case this devoid of evidence. No cell signal, no financial activity, no traceable movement. The case stalled before it could even begin. The last confirmed image of Russell Kinley was grainy, time-stamped 10:42 p.m., walking into a steel mill that operated all night, every night, filled with people, sound, machinery, and heat. And somehow, from inside one of the loudest places in town, he vanished, without a sound. The security footage didn't answer anything. If anything, it made everything worse. Investigators pulled the external tapes first, the lot, the side gate, the back access road. But the only clear image of Russell was from the east employee entrance, time-stamped 10:42 p.m. He appeared alone, carrying his thermos and wearing his usual Carhartt jacket. His face was blank, calm. He swiped his badge, waited for the red light to turn green, and stepped inside. That was it. That was the last anyone ever saw of him. The cameras inside the plant were unreliable. Half of them were there for insurance reasons only, and the rest hadn't recorded properly since the early 2000s. Whatever footage might have shown him walking toward the maintenance bay or the locker room either didn't exist or had been wiped by outdated software weeks earlier. There was no sign of him exiting the building. Detectives requested a full badge swipe log to confirm any movement beyond the entrance. According to the data, Russell never swiped out. His name never pinged any other internal checkpoints. If he'd tried to leave through any of the secured exits, someone would have been alerted. At least that's what the factory claimed. But on night shift, rules got softer, and it wasn't unusual for long-time workers to prop open side doors or bypass formal scans. Still, nobody could explain why there wasn't a single trace, no sighting, no witness, no sound. Russell's locker sat in the far corner of the night shift's locker bay, just beneath the old ventilation shaft. When officers opened it, his street clothes were still neatly folded inside. His wallet was in the pocket of his jeans, a pack of gum, his house keys, his pocket knife. A half-written note scribbled on the back of a supply checklist. Everything was there, everything except his uniform and boots. That meant he'd changed. He had intended to work that night. He had gone in ready. Detectives walked the factory floor, interviewed every man and woman assigned to the overnight shift. They moved from the furnace teams to packaging to control rooms to the maintenance quarters where Russell usually worked alone. No one remembered seeing him. Some said they assumed he was there. A few recalled hearing someone near the east corridor around 11:30, maybe a tool dropped. But nobody could say for certain they spoke to him. That shift had been quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary. Machines didn't break. Radios stayed silent. The first real disruption came only when the morning shift arrived and realized he wasn't clocking out. The shift supervisor, Terry Nolan, was brought in for formal questioning. He said Russell hadn't signed up for any overtime and wasn't scheduled for any repairs that night. Nolan admitted he hadn't spoken to him personally in over a week. He described Russell as invisible in the best way. Never late, never confrontational, just steady. When asked if there had been any recent conflict, changes in behavior, arguments, or complaints, Nolan shook his head. Honestly, he was the last guy I'd worry about. But someone wasn't convinced. Elaine pressed for deeper investigation. She said Russell had been distant the past few weeks, quiet at dinner, less responsive. She chalked it up to the seasonal fatigue that came with long shifts and cold nights. But now, in hindsight, she wondered, has something been bothering him? Had he seen something? Has someone been watching him? The search expanded over the next 48 hours. Cadaver dogs were brought in to sweep the entire plant. They were trained to detect trace scent even months after decomposition. The factory cleared 2 production lines to allow access to the older corners of the facility. The disused chemical corridors, the tool storage wing, the tunnels beneath the floor grates. The dogs stopped once, briefly, near the sub-basement maintenance shaft, but lost the scent within feet. Investigators searched for hidden doors, drainage hatches, structural weak points, any place a man could fall, hide, or be hidden. But nothing turned up. No drag marks, no blood, no fabric, No accident reports, just a long list of maybes. Employees began to talk in hushed tones. Some were scared, others are skeptical. A few muttered that maybe he just walked away. Factory work was hard, the hours were long, maybe he broke, maybe he cracked. But that didn't explain his truck still sitting there. It didn't explain why he'd left everything behind. It didn't explain the look on Elaine's face every time she asked if they'd searched the furnaces. By the end of the third day, the case had officially shifted from a welfare check to a criminal investigation. But without a crime scene, without evidence, without witnesses, it was a case in name only. The detectives met one last time in the break room that night, spread out the factory map on the table, and went section by section again. One of them paused near the northeast quadrant, the ventilation control wing. The building had been renovated twice in the last decade. Some of the older plans no longer matched the real layout. There were places on the map that had once been rooms. Now they were just walls. The officer made a note to revisit it. By then, Bryn had stopped going to school. She sat in a room, door closed, scrolling message boards about missing persons cases and survival timelines. Elaine kept calling the factory, asking if they'd found anything, an ID badge, a smudge, anything. But each time, the answer was no. No signs of him leaving, no signs of him staying. It was as if Russell Kinley had walked into Claremont Steelworks and never came back out. The first time someone said it out loud, it was almost a whisper. Just a stray comment from one of the plant workers being interviewed by police. A shrug, a glance away, and then, well, if he went into the furnace, you wouldn't find much, would you? That sentence landed like a hammer. It wasn't even an accusation, just a quiet observation. But once it was said, it couldn't be unsaid. The idea took hold, not officially, not on paper, but behind closed doors, in the sheriff's department, in hushed conversations between detectives, and worst of all, in the minds of Russell's family. It grew. The Claremont Steelworks used 3 blast furnaces, each running at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, non-stop, except for quarterly maintenance or emergencies. Russell had worked around them for years, usually on call for valve checks and piping inspections. He knew the layout, the hazard zones, the runoff channels. He'd once described it to a neighbor as standing next to hell's lungs. It was loud, fast, dangerous work, but also precise, controlled, and heavily monitored, or so everyone thought. Investigators brought the theory forward cautiously. The plant initially resisted. Shutting down even one furnace meant major production losses and backlash from corporations. But with pressure mounting from both law enforcement and the family, Claremont finally agreed to shut Furnace 2, the one Russell most often serviced, for a full day. It hadn't been taken offline in nearly 2 years. The shutdown happened early on a Saturday. Workers were told it was routine. Only a handful of people knew the real reason. Forensics teams moved in quickly. They took core samples from the slag pit, scraped cooling residue from the burn walls, and used specialized UV and X-ray scanners to search for organic remains. The furnace roared down slowly, breathing out its last superheated breath before going silent. It was a grim, almost sacred process. And then, silence. The examination took nearly 12 hours. No bone fragments were found, no teeth, no blood trace. The forensics team confirmed there was nothing organic in the waste material from the last several weeks, nothing human. But there was a problem. At the temperatures the furnace operated, even bone would reduce to ash in minutes. It wouldn't take much to erase a person, not much at all. This technical ambiguity unsettled the investigators more than they expected. The absence of evidence wasn't proof Russell had gone into the furnace, but it wasn't proof he hadn't either. The logs showed nothing unusual. No system overrides, no missing time. But they were old systems, half analog, poorly updated. Some logs were handwritten, some entries had gaps. When questioned, one of the night engineers admitted that if someone really wanted to dispose of something quietly, the hour between 2 and 3 a.m. was usually the deadest window. He claimed he wasn't implying anything, just stating facts. Elaine broke down when she heard about the theory. She imagined the worst, over and over again. The idea that her husband may have suffered, burned alive, silenced in the very place he'd spent years working, was unbearable. Bryn, now 17, reacted differently. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She stopped talking for 2 full days. Then, quietly, she began journaling. Spiral notebooks, one after the other. She filled them with dates, statements, questions, floor plans of the factory she found online, printouts from OSHA regulations, and notes about every single employee who'd been on shift that night. She started building her own timeline. At night, she sat at the kitchen table with a highlighter, circling names and drawing arrows. It became her way of controlling the chaos, documenting every hole, every inconsistency. Her handwriting got smaller with each page. The sheriff's office released an official statement the following week, stating that there was no current evidence, suggesting foul play, but all possibilities remain open. It was a diplomatic non-answer. The factory returned to normal. The furnaces roared back to life, and the workers walked back into the same building where a man had seemingly vanished into nothing. Rumors began to circulate more aggressively now. Some employees swore they saw a maintenance log entry with Russell's name, dated that same night, but then couldn't produce it. Others claimed the camera system used to cover the north loading dock had been down for months, not days. There were whispers that Claremont's night shift had its own code, unspoken rules, favors, debts, a culture that didn't take kindly to people asking too many questions. Whether Russell had crossed someone or simply seen something he shouldn't have, no one could say. But people stopped talking after that. Too many eyes watching, too many ears listening. And in the middle of it all, the furnace became more than a machine. It became a symbol, a bottomless void, a possibility too horrifying to prove and too plausible to dismiss. For Elaine, it became a place she couldn't drive past without gripping the wheel tighter. For Bryn, it became a focal point, a puzzle piece that wouldn't fit no matter how many angles she tried. And for the town, it became a quiet legend, whispered in corners, half believed and never resolved. A man had walked into a factory and disappeared. The furnace had been checked. But everyone kept asking the same question. What if someone made sure it was just clean enough? It started with a voicemail, a blocked number, just static for the first 3 seconds, then a man's voice, low, rushed. You need to look under, not through. Ask about the old tunnel. Then it cut off. The sheriff's office traced it, but the number was disposable, unregistered, probably a burner. But it was the first break in weeks, and by then, investigators were willing to chase whispers. The factory's blueprints had already been combed through multiple times, but those were the updated ones, digitized, sanitized. What they hadn't reviewed were the pre-merger records, back when Claremont Steel was 2 separate facilities stitched together during an early 90s corporate consolidation. Buried deep in the county's archive room, in a warped cardboard box marked structural permits, they found the original schematics. One detail stood out, a narrow corridor labeled Waste Routing Sub-Level B. The note beside it simply read, Sealed 1989. They brought it to Claremont's operations manager. He hesitated, said he wasn't familiar, called it before his time. But an older employee, a forklift operator named Dean, who'd worked the night shift for 30 years, overheard. He remembered the tunnel, said it used to run beneath the north furnace wing, connecting to a now-defunct chemical runoff station. It had been closed after a leak incident in the late 80s. No one had touched it since. No reason to. But now there was a reason. It took nearly a week to get the permits to break the seal. When they finally opened the access hatch, they found a steel staircase choked with rust. The air that came out was thick, metallic, and decades old. The tunnel stretched 50 yards under the main plant, a concrete passage just wide enough for a man to walk hunched. No lights, just ancient wireframes and waterlogged insulation dangling from above. The team moved slowly, flashlights catching rats, collapsed ductwork, and broken grates. The floor was slick with condensation. But then, Near the far end, just before the passage turned to a corroded maintenance alcove, they found it. A torn piece of lined paper, curled at the edges, water-stained but legible. Half of it had disintegrated, but the top corner remained. It bore the faded Claremont logo and the barely visible letters, Kinley, R. Just below that, a maintenance code, logged but never completed. Forensics couldn't date the paper with certainty, but the rust pattern around it suggested it had been there for years, maybe longer. Near the pipe where it was found, one of the investigators noticed something else, deep scrape marks in the concrete floor. Not recent, but not ancient either, as if a metal object, heavy, maybe wheeled, had been dragged through and then reversed. The theory formed wasn't good. Rumors began to gain traction, not among the public, this part hadn't been made public yet, but within the plant. People started saying there had always been a second chain of command on night shift. Not official, not documented. Just a small circle of senior men who'd worked together for years, answering to no one but each other. Floor managers signed off on jobs they never checked. Tools went missing and returned without question. There were whispers about off-the-book scrap deals, materials swapped or siphoned, sold to third parties under fake invoices. No one had ever proven it, but no one had ever really looked either. One man, an electrician who'd retired the year before, was interviewed quietly. He didn't say much, but he did say this: "You learn early on not to ask questions during the night shift. Keep your head down, do your job, leave the rest." When pressed about Russell, he simply shook his head. He was too by the book, didn't know when to look away. The focus of the investigation shifted. If Russell had stumbled onto something, an unauthorized job site, a theft in progress or worse, what would the men in that circle have done? Would they have covered it up? Could they have? Detectives revisited time card logs, searching for overlaps. Several names came up repeatedly. People whose shifts always aligned with Russell's, whose alibis were vague, inconsistent. But without witnesses, without physical evidence, it was all smoke. The sub-basement tunnel was sealed again the following week, not out of fear, but because there was nothing else to pull from it. No blood, no clothing, no cameras, just the torn paper and the feeling that whatever had happened down there had been planned, deliberate, and deeply quiet. Back at home, Bryn added the maintenance log fragment to her notebook. She circled the maintenance code, searched for it online. It didn't appear on any public index. She filed a request with OSHA under a pseudonym. She started cross-referencing parts orders and internal job requests from that month. If her father had written that slip, she wanted to know what he was walking into that night, and why he might have never come out. For Elaine, the tunnel was the last place she allowed herself to imagine. She wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't ask questions. In her mind, it was easier to believe Russell had been taken. But for Bryn, that pipe, that scrap of paper, and that silent, rotted hallway became something else entirely, a hidden path, one someone had gone to great lengths to erase. And now, it was her turn to walk it back. Elaine Kinley never moved out of the house. Everyone expected she would. Neighbors said it would be healthier, better for Bryn, maybe give her the fresh start she deserved. But she didn't. She stayed. She kept the porch light on. She watered the flower bed Russell had planted the summer before he disappeared, even when nothing grew in it anymore. Inside, the house never really changed. His flannel jacket stayed on the peg near the back door. His reading glasses, cracked at the hinge, were still on the kitchen windowsill. Even his favorite mug, faded blue with a chip in the handle, remained on the top shelf, untouched. It wasn't about hope anymore. It was about preserving something, something only she understood. The years blurred. There were searches that led nowhere, rumors that flared and died, articles that revisited the mystery each October and then quietly vanished from public view. New management took over the factory. The furnace rooms were modernized. A few of the older night shift workers either retired or relocated. Bryn left for college in 2012. She majored in criminal justice, not because she wanted to be a cop, but because she couldn't stop thinking about what hadn't been done. Her notebooks came with her, dozens of them by then, filled with maps, statements, shifts, dates, receipts, surveillance gaps, job codes, and side notes she'd never shown anyone. It wasn't about solving it. It was about understanding how something like this could happen, and how it had been allowed to fade. Elaine never missed a vigil. October 17th, every year, same time, same patch of grass near the factory gate. The first one had drawn local news, co-workers, church friends, even union reps. By year 4, it was just her, Bryn, and 2 others. By year 7, only Elaine remained. She'd light a single candle, say nothing, and stay for an hour. Sometimes longer. Sometimes until security came to ask her, gently, to move along. And she always did, politely. She wasn't there to make a scene. She just wanted someone to remember. Then, in 2015, 9 years since Russell vanished, a man named Wayne Myler died by suicide in a motel just outside Scranton. He'd worked the night shift at Claremont from 1995 to 2008, had been one of the old guards. After he left, he'd dropped off the map, worked odd jobs, lived alone, no spouse, no kids. At first, his death didn't raise alarms, but a motel worker found a note tucked behind the bathroom mirror, folded neatly, 6 words, no signature, just, "Ask about the locker." He never left. The coroner flagged it and contacted local authorities. The name Kinley came up during the check. The note was sent to the county sheriff's office, who in turn passed it to the cold case division. Elaine received the call late that week. She didn't cry. She just listened, asked them to read it again. Then she asked if they were finally going to do something. The locker in question had been opened in the early days of the investigation. Russell's belongings, his wallet, jacket, and keys, were removed and logged into evidence. But the locker itself had been reused later, repainted, and supposedly reissued to another worker before being decommissioned during renovations in 2010. The plant had changed hands since then, and the locker room layout had been modified. There were no clear records of which unit was his anymore. But Elaine remembered. Locker 413. It had been etched into the back of one of his pocket notepads, one he used to keep in his shirt pocket. He once joked it was easy to remember, same numbers as their anniversary. Bryn came home that weekend. She hadn't been back to Mayfield in nearly 2 years. Her hair was shorter, her posture is more rigid, but she still wore her father's old watch, and she still kept a notebook in her bag. She asked to see the locker, asked if it still existed. Security at the plant was hesitant at first, said everything in that wing had been cleaned out years ago. But Bryn insisted. She filed a formal request, then another. After 3 weeks of delay, the factory finally granted limited access, escorted only. They walked the row slowly. Some lockers had been removed, others welded shut during past renovations. Locker 413 was still there, barely. Its number had been painted over, but you could still see the indentation if you looked close. It hadn't been used in years, and more importantly, it hadn't been opened in years either. The hinges were sealed, welded. Bryn stared at it without speaking. Elaine stepped forward and pressed her palm to the metal, cold, uneven, just like the night she waited for him to come home. The factory supervisor said they'd need a permit to cut it open, that it was probably just rusted shut from time, that it wasn't anything sinister. But the phrase from the note kept echoing in her head. He never left. And suddenly, all the years of silence felt heavier. Because maybe he never did. The question of the locker hadn't left Bryn's mind since the day she stood in front of it. The number had been scraped off. The outside was dull with rust and time, but it hadn't been reassigned, and it hadn't been opened. That she knew for certain. Weld lines along the hinges confirmed it. Someone had sealed it deliberately, sometime after her father vanished and before anyone thought to check again. But why? And more importantly, what could possibly be inside that no one wanted found? Back in the official case file, the original key to Russell's locker had been logged into evidence in 2006, bagged and labeled after his wallet, boots, and thermos were recovered. But sometime over the next few years, it went missing. not documented as released, not checked out by anyone on record. The chain of custody ended abruptly after the case was moved from active to cold. It was a small thing, maybe, a misplaced item in a decade-old investigation. But to Bryn, it was just one more loose end that didn't sit right. She filed a new petition, this time not as a grieving daughter, but as a trained researcher. She had her degree now. She knew the procedures. She cited procedural failures, missing documentation, and potential obstruction. It got attention. Within a month, the district attorney's office approved a formal reinvestigation of the Kinley disappearance, granting limited access to long-term storage and previously restricted site areas inside the Claremont facility. It wasn't the same plant anymore. Most of the original management had been replaced. The break rooms had been remodeled, walls painted over. The row of lockers where her father used to change into his uniform had been condensed, with some units removed entirely. But locker 413 remained, and it hadn't been opened in almost 15 years. The decision to cut it open wasn't made lightly. The plant's legal team tried to delay the request, citing structural integrity, liability concerns, and procedural red tape. But Bryn wasn't letting it go. The DA's office pushed through a limited warrant under forensic discovery statutes, giving the cold case task force 48 hours of supervised access to the locker room. When they arrived, a facilities supervisor pointed out that the locker had likely been sealed during the 2010 asbestos remediation. The weld marks weren't part of the original design, and nobody could explain who ordered it done. The welding had been clean, professional, but the hinges gave way after a few tense minutes under a rotary saw. A cold silence hung over the group as the door creaked, reluctant to open, metal shrieking slightly before the lock gave out. What they expected to find was unclear. Dust, old clothes, nothing. But what they saw was something else entirely. Inside were Russell's boots, still upright, still tied. A plastic lunch container with a dried, unidentifiable smear inside. A folded maintenance shirt with his embroidered name patch half hanging from the seam. And at the bottom, tucked into the corner, a sealed envelope. It was brittle with age, the edges browned and curling. Across the front, written in faded black ink, were 4 words: "Do not trust Nolan." The name hit Bryn like a punch. Terry Nolan, the night floor manager in 2006, the one who'd claimed Russell had no issues, who said he hadn't seen anything unusual that night, the one who signed off on shift logs that no longer existed. Bryn stared at the envelope, but didn't reach for it. One of the forensic officers gently bagged it. Nearby, an evidence tech used a flashlight to scan the locker's inner frame. Behind a false panel in the back wall, a retrofit that didn't match the rest, they found a small hidden cavity. Inside it, a rolled-up maintenance logbook, wrapped in clear plastic, and a disposable film camera. Neither item had been logged in the original case file. The locker had never been emptied. It had been sealed. Back at the evidence lab, the team handled the items with extreme care. The camera film would take time to recover. The envelope was scanned and opened under supervision. Inside were several folded pages, photocopies of factory incident reports, 3 handwritten notes, and a marked map of the plant with one room circled in red, 403. A room that, according to current records, no longer existed. Bryn's hands shook when she saw it. It wasn't just the contents. It was the knowledge that someone, maybe more than one person, had gone to great lengths to hide them. That for all the years the family had been told there was nothing more to find, the truth had been locked away, not lost, stored behind steel, protected not by oversight, but by intent, and someone had left a warning. Do not trust Nolan. For the first time, the investigation no longer felt like it was chasing a ghost. There were names now, documents, directions. Whatever had happened to Russell Kinley hadn't been random. It hadn't been an accident, and it hadn't been without witnesses. The answers were no longer just theories. They were tangible, held in paper and plastic and film inside a locker that had waited nearly 2 decades to be opened. And at the center of all of it was a single, silent message. He never left. The locker door groaned as it gave way, metal curling outward like a wound reopening after years sealed shut. It had been nearly 2 decades since anyone had touched locker 413. The cold case unit watched as the door finally released, and for a long, silent moment, no one moved. Not because they expected something violent or grotesque, but because they understood what they were about to see had survived in silence all this time, untouched, unmentioned, and almost buried. Inside, the air was stale with rust and time. The contents weren't flashy, nothing dramatic, just Russell's work boots standing neatly against the back wall. A plastic lunch container with a warped lid, its contents long dried and crumbled into indistinguishable residue. A worn navy blue uniform folded into a perfect square, the name patch still stitched across the chest. Kinley, R. A maintenance logbook sat beside it, pages curled and ink faded, filled with check marks and small annotations about valve pressure, tool shortages, faulty wires. Nothing alarming at first glance, but the details didn't matter yet. What mattered was that it all was still there, uncollected, unprocessed. Forensic tags had never touched it because no one ever thought to look again. An evidence tech reached for the back panel of the locker, a sheet of aluminum that didn't quite match the others, slightly lighter in color, less corroded. It gave after a few taps. Behind it, in a shallow cavity, lay something entirely different. Folded tightly into the compartment were a second set of clothes, civilian, not work-issued. Jeans, a gray t-shirt, socks, and a pair of off-brand sneakers. Strange, because Russell had never driven to work in casual wear. He always changed at home. Taped to the side of the cavity was a standard black audio cassette. The tape looked decades old, with a single strip of masking tape across the spine where someone had written in shaky capital letters, Tuesday, 10:45 p.m. Beneath the cassette was a thick manila envelope, sealed with yellowing tape. The words, "Do not trust night foreman," scrawled in bold permanent marker across the front. Bryn stepped back as it was pulled from the compartment. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The handwriting was her father's. She'd seen it 1,000 times growing up, on post-it notes, grocery lists, and Christmas labels. This was his. Unmistakably his. The contents of the envelope were spread out across a sterile evidence table hours later. Inside were a handful of photocopied documents, complaints to the union dated several months before Russell's disappearance. All of them detailed unauthorized work hours, skipped inspections, and supply chain discrepancies related to the night shift. One memo had been addressed directly to Terry Nolan, the night floor manager. It had been ignored. Another showed that Russell had filed a complaint about inconsistencies in equipment inventories, tools signed out by men who had supposedly been off duty. The pattern suggested ghost labor, jobs performed off the books, materials disappearing, possibly resold. But one item inside the envelope stood out. A folded sheet of graph paper, yellowed and creased at the corners. It was a map, hand-drawn, detailed. It showed the full layout of Claremont Steelworks as it had existed in 2006, including now-defunct rooms that no longer appeared on official blueprints. At the bottom corner, in the same handwriting, was a date, October 15th, 2006, just 2 nights before Russell vanished. The entire east wing of the plant was mapped in thick pencil lines, but one room in particular was circled twice in red ink, 403. It had no label, no descriptor, just the number. Bryn asked to see the current layout of the factory. Room 403 didn't exist, at least not anymore. That was the turning point. Until now, the case had been haunted by speculation, possibility without substance. But this was different, tangible, time-stamped. It showed Russell had been trying to document something. He hadn't just stumbled into danger. He had been tracking it, recording it, preparing to expose it. The audio tape was sent for digitization immediately. Technicians warned the quality might be poor, that the age and storage conditions could have compromised the magnetic ribbon. Bryn didn't care. She needed to hear it. The idea that her father's voice might still exist somewhere, frozen on that cassette, made everything else feel real again. Not just grief or theory or memory, but something closer, something verifiable. Detectives re-examined Nolan's employment history. After Russell's disappearance, he'd quietly transferred to a different plant in another state. He retired in 2012, never contacted again. But now, with Russell's envelope naming him directly, and with room 403 reappearing in a map that shouldn't exist, the sheriff's department reopened their interview file on him. They were no longer chasing shadows. They had a direction. Bryn held the map in her hands that night in the evidence room, not as a daughter hoping for closure, but as someone beginning to understand just how far someone went to erase her father, and just how much he had tried to leave behind in return. Room 403 didn't exist, not on paper, not in the official schematics of Claremont Steelworks. According to the blueprints submitted during the plant's last renovation in 2010, the space where room 403 had once stood was now part of a reinforced wall that separated the furnace corridor from a sealed-off utilities wing. But the hand-drawn map recovered from Russell's locker told a different story. And when that map was cross-referenced with architectural records from the early 2000s, the contradictions were impossible to ignore. Bryn sat across from the cold case unit as they laid the plans side by side, old and new. The dimensions were off. A rectangular gap about 10 feet wide and 15 feet long appeared in the 2003 blueprint, but vanished entirely in the updated one. There were no demolition records filed for that area, no permits, no inspection notes, just absence. It wasn't just a forgotten space. It had been intentionally removed from the record. The factory denied knowing anything about room 403. Most of the current staff had never heard of it. But when retired employees were contacted, a few remembered it, vaguely. One man recalled it being used as a calibration lab in the early 2000s, a place where precision tools were tested under controlled conditions. Another said it was shut down after an electrical fire shorted the main console. A third man said it had always been strange, small, soundproofed, never really used after the fire. The more they asked, the clearer it became. The room had existed. Then one day, it hadn't. With probable cause established, a team was dispatched to the factory. The section of wall in question was located behind a row of storage units in a low-traffic area near the back of the furnace wing. The space had been turned into a makeshift storage corridor, boxes, unused carts, disassembled ductwork. But behind all of it was the wall, flat, painted over, seamless. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. Within minutes, the results confirmed what Russell's map had predicted. A void, 6 feet wide, running roughly 10 feet deep, hidden behind 2 layers of reinforced drywall and insulated paneling. No access point, no vent shafts, no doors, just a hollow space that wasn't supposed to be there. The demolition order came through quietly. On a Thursday morning, while most of the factory's attention was directed at a routine equipment check on the far end of the property, a forensic demolition team began removing the wall piece by piece. There was no ceremony, just drills, crowbars, and silence. It took less than 2 hours to break through. Behind the final panel, the air was stale, heavier than it should have been. The room wasn't large, just enough space for a man to stand or sit. The walls were lined with soundproof insulation, much of it deteriorated, but still intact in patches. A broken stool lay on its side in the corner. A rusted vent duct protruded from the back wall, choked with dust. No tools, no equipment, no fixtures. The floor was concrete, stained dark in places. At first glance, it seemed empty, forgotten. But then the forensics team found the hair. Strands caught in the corner where the wall met the floor, partially embedded in a crack in the concrete. Nearby, a dried smear. Trace material was collected, swabbed, and rushed to the lab. The room was sealed for evidence processing. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew what they were expecting. 3 days later, confirmation came back. The DNA was a match for Russell Kinley. Elaine was notified first, then Bryn. Neither cried. Not right away. For so long, Russell had existed only in fragments, missing reports, blurred surveillance footage, the spaces he used to fill in a house that hadn't heard his voice in 19 years. But now there was a room, a place, proof. It didn't bring peace, not yet, but it closed a chapter that had been stuck open too long. Bryn returned to the site later that week, stood in front of the empty space that had once been room 403. She didn't ask questions, not yet. She just listened. The factory was loud again, business as usual, but now she knew that behind those walls, in that sealed, silent space, her father had spent his final moments, alone, forgotten, locked away in a room someone had worked very hard to erase. And as she stared at the cracked concrete and the dust-covered vent, she knew with certainty this wasn't an accident. Someone had put him there, someone had sealed that room, and someone had hoped he'd never be found. The tape was warped. Years of humidity, temperature shifts, and exposure to metal had degraded it almost to the point of uselessness. It had sat behind the false panel of locker 413 for nearly 2 decades, its label faded, the spool barely holding its tension. Audio specialists handled it like it was made of glass. They ran it through a baking process to restore the ribbon structure, then transferred it to digital format, cleaning it inch by inch until sound finally emerged, distant, hiss-heavy, but unmistakably human. It was Russell's voice. The first 30 seconds were quiet, just the sound of breathing and the subtle click of him adjusting the recorder. Then he began speaking, low, hurried, and clearly on edge. He described inconsistencies in scrap inventory, steel orders that didn't match what was being melted down, truck logs showing midnight pickups that weren't on the schedule. He named specific units, specific time windows. He said he brought it up to the union steward twice, but got vague reassurances. He said he didn't feel safe. Then came the names. Terry Nolan, 2 other supervisors, men who'd been with Claremont for over 20 years. Russell said they were manipulating the numbers, underrating scrap value, signing off on fraudulent loads, and pushing product out through third-party vendors with falsified barcodes. He didn't know how deep it went, but he said it had to be more than just them. The system required silence, clerks, warehouse leads, maybe even someone higher up. The math wasn't adding up. Neither were the shifts. He said he was documenting everything, but the more he logged, the more he noticed things around him change. Tool drawers left open, equipment missing, then suddenly reappearing, work orders reassigned without explanation. He didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear. Someone knew what he was doing. Then the tape changed. At around the 6-minute mark, there was a shift in his voice. His breathing quickened. The background noise grew sharper. Boots on metal, a door slamming. He whispered that someone had followed him, that he'd ducked into the old calibration room, room 403. He didn't think they saw him, but he couldn't be sure. He said he had the camera with him, the one found in his locker. He said if anything happened, someone needed to check the envelope. He said, plainly, "Don't trust Nolan." The last 2 minutes were almost unbearable. Heavy banging, screeching metal. Russell is trying to barricade something from the inside. His voice turned desperate. He said he didn't understand how they found him so fast. He said he could hear them outside the door, that someone was talking. But he couldn't make out the words. Then came a long stretch of silence, 10, maybe 12 seconds, followed by one final bang so loud it cracked the audio. And then, nothing. The file ended there. For investigators, the tape confirmed what they had started to suspect. Russell hadn't just disappeared, he'd been cornered, and whoever reached him that night had made sure his body would never be found, at least not in their lifetime. But they hadn't counted on the tape surviving, or the envelope, or the map. Further digging into renovation records from 2010 revealed something chilling. The work order that resulted in the wall being sealed over room 403 had been signed off by a former facilities consultant, an alias traced back to a now retired supervisor living in West Virginia. His real name, Terrence Nolan. Now in his early 70s, Nolan had moved out of state just 2 years after Russell vanished. He had never been formally charged, but he had refused all interviews since the original investigation. With the discovery of the tape, the documents in the envelope, and the forensic evidence from room 403, a warrant was finally issued. He was arrested quietly at his home without incident. When questioned, he denied everything. But the timeline, his access to renovation approvals, his name on the work order that sealed the locker, and his long-standing connection to the very part of the plant where Russell was last seen, was enough. Enough to file charges. Enough to finally name someone responsible. The factory declined to comment. Most of the other names Russell had mentioned had either retired or passed away. The embezzlement scheme was never fully unraveled. By the time investigators pieced together how much money had actually moved, the trail had gone cold. But that no longer mattered to Bryn, or to Elaine. What mattered was the tape, the voice, the knowledge that Russell had done everything he could to leave a trail. Even in fear, even with time running out, he had thought ahead. He had hidden evidence in the one place no one had thought to look, inside the space that symbolized his disappearance. The locker no one reopened, the container no one believed still held truth. Now they knew better. He hadn't just vanished, he had been silenced, and he had left everything they needed to finally prove it. On a gray morning in late spring, Bryn and Elaine stood outside the factory gates, watching as crews worked behind the caution tape. The side wing of Claremont Steelworks was being dismantled slowly, piece by piece, the air thick with dust and diesel. What remained of room 403 had been sealed off once more, not to erase it, but to preserve it for recovery teams. Inside, forensic archaeologists moved carefully, collecting every possible trace. Bone fragments, fabric threads, a metal watch band, a cracked lens from a pair of safety glasses. Every item was logged, sealed, and stored. This time, nothing would be overlooked. The remains confirmed what they already knew. Russell had died in that room, alone, hidden behind walls designed to keep people from ever asking questions. What no one expected was how much evidence still lingered. Microfibers in the vent filters, faded boot impressions in the corner, and more documentation behind the insulation than anyone had guessed. It would take months to process it all, but the mystery that had hung over Mayfield for 19 years no longer felt like a question. It felt like a truth too long buried. A private burial was held just outside town. Russell was finally laid to rest next to his parents, under a headstone that read, "Always on the job." Dozens attended, people who hadn't spoken his name aloud in years, old co-workers, former union reps, even one of the original detectives who'd worked the case in 2006. Elaine didn't speak at the service. She couldn't, but Bryn did. She talked about the silence that followed her family like a shadow for nearly 2 decades, about the nights she'd sat in the dark, listening to her mother breathe from the next room, wondering if she was still awake, about the notebooks she kept hidden from everyone, and about the locker. The company didn't release a statement at first, but after Nolan's arrest, after the tape was made public, and after multiple outlets picked up the story, the legal pressure mounted. A civil suit was filed on behalf of the Kinley family. Wrongful death, obstruction, negligent oversight. It was clear the company knew more than it had ever acknowledged. Internal memos surfaced, safety complaints ignored, renovation records doctored. It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a system that enabled people like Nolan to operate in silence, knowing no one would ever look too closely. And when someone finally did, when Russell did, it cost him his life. The settlement, if it came, would take years. But Bryn had already decided what to do with it. She launched a non-profit in her father's name, the 413 Foundation. Its mission was simple: protect blue-collar whistleblowers, provide legal aid, cover anonymous reporting systems, and document industrial workplace violations that rarely made it into the public eye. Within weeks, she had volunteers from 5 states and calls from families who said they'd seen too much, been told to stay quiet, and didn't know who to trust. For them, Russell's story wasn't just tragic, it was familiar. Back at Claremont, renovations were halted indefinitely. The company agreed to allow a memorial to be built near the outer perimeter, just beyond the former East Wing. It wasn't elaborate, just a concrete base, a small plaque, and one unmistakable centerpiece. Russell's locker, still rusted, still intact, still scarred by the weld lines that had sealed it shut. It was mounted upright in the center of the site, its door permanently ajar, not sanitized, not repainted, just as it was when they opened. It, old, unassuming, and impossibly significant. The evidence had been removed, but what it represented remained, a container of truth hidden in plain sight. On the anniversary of his disappearance, Bryn and Elaine returned to the memorial. This time, they weren't alone. Dozens of supporters came, families of the disappeared, retired plant workers, young organizers. They lit candles, placed gloves and safety tags at the base, and stood in silence, not out of habit, but out of recognition, that the cost of speaking up should never be your life. Elaine reached out and touched the edge of the locker. She didn't say anything, just held her hand there, as if finally answering the question that had haunted her for 19 years. Where was he? He was here the whole time.